Tucker, thank you for being brave enough to come on for round two here.
Brave enough. It's a pleasure, Anthony. The last 2-hour conversation we had was a real treat. I hope my energy's up for whatever we're going to get into today.
Yeah, I will. For anyone who's jumping into this one, I will have recorded a little bit of an intro for this, recapping the first one, but probably go back and just listen to the episode first before you continue here, because we're going to go a little bit further into the weeds. So first episode, we talked all about why these, seed oils, linoleic acid, and omega-6 fatty acids, how to think about them, where they're at, why they're generally a problem. Using common sense, I typically hope would convince a lot of people that consuming this industrial toxic sludge that has never been eaten in all of human history, that, okay, it's probably makes sense to not have this, but here we are. We live in 2021 where everybody has opposing views and cherry picks data and presents things from a mechanistic point of view. So we chatted before about doing this episode in a little bit more of a way of thinking about, okay, what are the people who are defending these large industrial seed oils? They defend it with certain stances. And I haven't had a chance to dig in and have rebuttals prepared or think about this intelligently nearly as much as you have. So I'm excited to dig in and get your opinion about this stuff. But generally speaking, it falls into a lot of different categories. Hopefully we can cover a good majority of them today. But the main one I want to start with and just go right into is regarding inflammation. So the big thing that I think there's, simpletons online promoting health advice like myself that, may say things like, hey, this may lead to...
You're unfair to yourself.
Don't eat these things, and then say, here's why. And then because blah, 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 blah can lead to these things, and try to lump it together for people to generally have a heuristic in their head, like, oh, this is bad. And one of those things is inflammation. So inflammation is a tricky topic. And it's something that when I was in my practice, I dealt with it on basically every single day basis, because I had a lot of people with musculoskeletal conditions coming in. And when people say inflammation, I just wanted to pull that apart real quick and talk about the process of inflammation, why it's bad. Probably in your case, it would be helpful to define acute versus chronic inflammation. And then we can talk about the role of high amounts of linoleic acid, omega-6, or, more broadly speaking, vegetable oils, and how they relate to inflammation. So do you want to give a brief overview of inflammation, why it's bad and that, or do you want me to dig into it? Or how do you want to?
I will, because the first thing to understand about inflammation is that it's not bad, right? Inflammation is uniformly a response to an injury. It is part of your body's healing process. So the notion that inflammation is something that is bad and something you should avoid is kind of a fundamental mistake. So let me explain. There's what causes inflammation. If you get hit and you get a bruise, that will cause inflammation. The damaged tissues release signals that your body interprets as indicating damage, and your body comes and cleans up the damaged tissues and allows the healthy cells to regrow and repair the damage, right? If you get an infection, it similarly damages tissues and produces those same chemical signals into your body that indicate that something is going amiss. So what we're really looking at is not inflammation per se, but what they call sterile inflammation. So there's inflammation where you have an obvious pathogenic or damage cause, right? You've been burned, you've been hit, you were infected with either a virus or a bacteria. And those are all good inflammation because it's going to help heal you. And there's lots of evidence in the literature that if you block that inflammatory pathway, so for instance, if you sprain your ankle and you take NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, it won't heal as well, right? Mm-hmm. So inflammation is a necessary part of the healing process. It'll heal, but it won't heal as well. Yeah. So
the redness, the swelling, the pain, these are all processes of your body recruiting certain cells to the area. Again, say you tripped off a curb, you sprain your ankle, that will happen. What a lot of people do is they get recommendations from their MDs to just pop these, Tylenol, ibuprofen, stuff like this.
Or rest.
Yeah,
What
right.
does rice stand for again? But
Rest,
one of the elements there is right. One of the elements there is to lower the temperature of the tissue. That's why you put ice on things. When you do that, you lower the inflammation, but you also impair the healing process.
Yeah.
And even the fellow, this is getting a little off topic for what I prepared here, but I've got a couple of old posts on my blog. I think it's titled as Rice Paleo, where the fellow who came up with the rice protocol has since recanted and said, no, anything you do that impairs inflammation is bad for wound healing. And I think that's a fundamental thing that you have to understand. And it's a fundamental thing that medicine often gets wrong, right? So inflammation is not a bad thing. Now, if you get, say, I don't know, I mean, if you get if somebody injects you with a bacterium that's going to cause an inflammation, that's bad. But the bad thing isn't the inflammation. The bad thing is that you've been, what caused the inflammation. So then you get into this idea of sterile inflammation, right? Which gets into chronic inflammation. So what we just described is all acute inflammation. It's inflammation that's caused by an injury. It happens immediately. All of that's good. I'll posit, right? There may be some tiny cases where you can say it's problematic, but in general, it's good because it's healing. When you get into sterile inflammation, you get into chronic inflammation, which is inflammation that doesn't resolve, right? That's the kind of inflammation that's associated with chronic disease. And sterile inflammation means that there is no pathogenic or obviously injury cause for that inflammation. That's the kind of inflammation that we're really concerned about.
Yeah.
Okay. Does all that make sense?
Yeah. The way I like to summarize it too for people is that thinking about it as, in inflammation being, like a recruitment from your body to do something to fix it. So the same thing, if you had a fire in your house and you had firemen come and spray at the fire with fire hoses, great. That is the role of, like you said, an acute inflammation where that's good. The fire hose is off once the fire is out, and then the fire truck gets out of there. This chronic, more sterile inflammation is they leave the fire truck there with the hose on running 24 hours a day indefinitely after the fire's out.
And it ultimately washes your house away.
Right. Not ideal. Yeah. And so, these are two separate things. And it's great to clarify that because, like you said, it can blunting the healing process is not great, but having this process go on indefinitely when there's no overt healing to do, also not great.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. And then we get into more to the point of seed oils, this whole idea of seed oils being pro-inflammatory, omega-6 fats, which are generally the fats found in seed oils, being pro-inflammatory, and omega-3 fats, which are, what you find in fish oil and pastured dairy and ruminants, being anti-inflammatory. That is true as a general statement, but it's also a gross oversimplification because your body doesn't produce one or the other. It produces both of them, and it produces them at the same time, right, in sequence. So it's trying to stimulate an inflammatory process, and then you have these chemicals that are known as resolvins, which are trying to resolve the inflammatory process. And some of the resolvins are omega-6 fats derived from omega-6 fats, right? So it's not quite as simple as people would like to portray it as being. And to kind of jump ahead at its touch, when people say, oh, omega-6 fats don't cause inflammation, they're kind of right and they're kind of wrong. They're oversimplifying it and kind of setting up a straw man, right? Because they're pro-inflammatory, they're also anti-inflammatory. And if you look to really understand the process and where it's getting us in a health perspective. I interviewed a fellow by the name of Bruce Hammock a couple of months ago. He's a scientist at UC Davis, and he discovered something called soluble epoxy hydrolase, which is a enzyme in the body that produces resolvins and pro-inflammatory chemicals out of omega-6 fats, right? And he commented that 75% of the drugs we sell by weight. So I mean, think about that. By weight, that's a lot. We're talking tons of drugs here, are sold to treat the omega-6 inflammatory pathway. So that includes COX inhibitors, it includes aspirins, it includes all of the NSAIDs, right? What they're all treating is the pathway that goes from omega-6 arachidonic acid into these pro-inflammatory chemicals, right? That stimulate inflammation in your body, right? But they're only part of the story, because as we discussed the last time we were talking about this, if you have arthritis, one of the things they're going to prescribe you is one of those drugs, right? Which is blocking that pathway. But typically, all they're doing is blocking the pain and the swelling pathways, right? They're not actually blocking, specifically arthritis is a great example for this, because when you take those drugs, they do nothing to protect you against the damage that's happening in your cartilage. They just ameliorate some of the signals that your body is sending out to the rest of your body to say, hey, something's wrong here, right? It's why I'm not a big fan of, when you get an injury, taking anti-pain medication, because part of what you're supposed to do when you get an injury is, you sprain your ankle, you're supposed to favor the ankle, which gives your body a chance to repair the damage to the tendons and the ligaments. That is the sprain. And then once the pain goes away, then you can go back to using that limb like you're supposed to. I mean, one of my favorite examples, I pulled my calf muscle when I was mountain biking, and I immediately, right afterwards, got stung by 2 yellow jackets, which rather distracted me away from what had happened to my calf. And I forgot about the pain in the calf, and I kept using it, and the pain kept coming back. And finally, once I remembered, I was like, oh yeah, my calf hurt me before I got stung by the yellow jackets. And only then did I decide, okay, take the standard 6 weeks off, rest it. And after that, gave it the opportunity to heal up. That's what that pain signal is telling you to do. It's saying, lay off, buddy, right? And if you, in my case, ignore the pain signal because you have a bigger pain happening, you don't get that cue that you need to give your body some time to repair the damage.
Right. So even or chronic things, in this case, pain is generally an indicator from the body that something's wrong and that you should pay attention to it. And I think there'd be a much broader philosophical conversation about our current civilization's ability to withstand discomfort and pain. But this is a natural thing that is an advantage for our species to, again, get the ankles sprained, or even if we have an arthritic condition, arthritis or anything with the itis, with the etymologies people are caught up. Itis is inflammation of arthros joints. So inflammation of the joints is what that term means. The question you should be really asking here is not, how do I remove the symptomology and the pain, but why is this causing pain in the first place? And like you said, if we remove that signal, you're not going to understand that there's some underlying pathology going on, therefore continual destruction of the joint. Last time we talked about how many people have degenerative disc disease, things like that. Not good when you take away the signal and let your joints basically deteriorate on themselves. So not great. And this is what you said, 75% of by weight, what were sold as
are drugs that are blocking the conversion of omega-6 fats into pain and inflammation mediators.
And so is this happening via linoleic acid to arachidonic acid to cytokines?
Well, So that's where things unfortunately start getting complicated. So let's just go back a moment to, refer back to, again, our previous conversation. In our natural environment, we would have gotten X amount of omega-6 fats and Y amount of omega-3 fats from our natural diets, right? And they're pretty much, it could be 1-for-1 or 3-to-1 or, somewhere in that range, but it was in that kind of range. And these are generally pretty rare fats in the environment. All organisms have problems with the susceptibility of polyunsaturated fats to oxidation, so you can't use them too much as a structural element because they tend to break down, right? I mean, in doing my reading, I've come across all these papers talking about the problems that plants have with lactic acid breaking down, right? And it's just a fundamental problem of the molecule. So then fast forward to the beginning of the industrial age, and we developed this ability to mass produce these fats from plant sources, omega-6 fats, and they fortunately, or unfortunately, rather, are things that are very susceptible to rancidity, but that we don't detect as rancid in the same way we detect omega-3 fats as rancid, right? So we can consume them way in excess of what we had been consuming from an evolutionary standpoint. Now, when you mention, I want to go off on a little bit of a tangent here. When you mention our current ability to tolerate pain, one of the things that I discovered when I first fixed my diet, shortly after that, and this sounds a little funny, but it's an interesting anecdote. So I'm a history student, and I used to read all of these accounts. You read the accounts of the Greek wars and the Latin wars, and you hear, in medieval knights fighting, and these guys would take these epic injuries and keep fighting on like it was nothing. It's amazing. You look at them and then you look at us and you think, wow, these guys are so much tougher than we were. So right after I fixed my diet, I was walking down the stairs and I tripped and fell down half a flight of stairs. And I was, a little shocked, and I got up and I was like, took inventory and everything seemed to be okay. And I was like, okay, fine. So I went out and I spent the day skiing, and I came home and I went into the shower. And as I was getting into the shower, I looked into the mirror and I had a huge bruise across the back of my arm that didn't hurt, right? Whatever pain, and I'm assuming it happened because I hit one of the stairs when I fell backwards into the stairs, and didn't hurt, didn't notice it all day. And what I've noticed since then, and other people have noticed as well, is a similar thing where when you have a more natural omega-6 to omega-3 balance, you have, I wouldn't even call it more pain tolerance, because you're not actually getting more pain. You're getting just less pain, right? Another thing that happened to me one day, I was in the gym and I have a torn meniscus in my right knee. And from my first ski day skiing, actually, that's never been treated. It's not serious enough to need treating. So I was in the gym one day and I had picked up a dumbbell to put it back in the rack, and I twisted, and I did it just the right way so that I tweaked the meniscus in my knee. And I had this sharp, immediate pain, and overnight my knee swelled up like a grapefruit. And I was like, oh no, I've really done a number on myself here. This stinks. And I got up the next morning and there was no pain. There was no swelling. And just to see how it went, I went and ran 6 miles and totally fine, right? So what I've noticed, we can get into people who get burns, and the burns don't seem to burn you as much, but when you get down to the mechanisms of what is actually causing pain, the reason we take aspirin and the reason we take NSAIDs and the reason we take COX inhibitors is because they block this pathway. And my experience has been when you're taking less omega-6 fats, your inflammation resolves a lot faster, whatever the cause, right? You are less susceptible to injury and you're much less susceptible to pain. And I mean, I've posted pictures on Twitter of my various idiotic mountain biking injuries where I fall off my bike at full speed and plow a furrow in the ground with my knee and get up and it's bleeding all over the place. And, it's a fundamentally different experience. And it started to me thinking about maybe if the reason all those guys back in the history books they weren't tougher, they were just experiencing less pain, right? And they're just resolving the inflammation a lot faster than we are. Okay. Now you've got an incredibly querulous / skeptical look on your face. So I'm sure there's some question coming out of there.
I'm just thinking of the counterexamplar here and go, oh, but this is just anecdote, Tucker.
It's just anecdote. Yes.
And actually so if I'm traveling, sometimes I can't get around it. I'd say screw it and have some meals that otherwise wouldn't have with seed oils in them and maybe bread or grains, things like that. That plus lack of sleep, travel, I will get achiness in old injuries and I'll feel creaky and I'll get basically these old things be like, oh yeah, that's right. That's when I know my body is in an inflamed state personally. But again, the anecdote here is not helpful in the eyes of the counterexamplar.
Right. But then one gets into, anecdote is how I got into this whole thing, right? Because I noticed this thing where when I stopped eating seed oils, I had all these effects and I was curious about, what's going on. And as I think we mentioned, or as we should say, what really motivates people is anecdote. It's not data. As much as people say that it's data, it's really anecdote. So I wanted to lead off with my experience, and then let's start talking about what the science shows, right? So as far as pain goes and chronic pain goes, Christopher Ramsden, who runs the lipid peroxidation lab at the NIH, has been doing a long-standing series of experiments with people who have chronic migraines, which is a kind of chronic pain. Typically, these are people who have multiple serious headaches a month. And he put them on a low linoleic acid diet for a fairly short period of time, and their chronic pain symptoms got better. That's kind of interesting. At the moment, I think he's done 3 different experiments, and all 3 were consistent. And the most recent one was really interesting because he actually failed to get them as low as he wanted to in the dietary protocol, meaning he failed to reduce their omega-6 intake as much as he wanted to in the dietary protocol. Still reduced a lot compared to the average American. And nevertheless, he was able to reduce their headache incidence more than any drug we have is able to do, right?
With poor compliance.
It wasn't poor compliance implies they weren't following the diet. It was just really hard for him to find foods that were low enough in linoleic acid, given a modern diet, given the modern food environment, to lower it as much as he wanted, but he still saw benefit, right?
Did they do controls?
I don't remember that, honestly. I presume he must have, because this is, he did the pilot study, and the pilot study was a success. And this was like the first step of the bigger study that he's trying to do across a whole bunch of hospitals. So, there's a definite pathway here between diet and, now, incidentally, these headaches that people are getting are considered to be a inflammatory condition. Neuroinflammation is what is thought to cause these chronic headaches. So dietary linoleic acid, chronic inflammatory disease, it is improved by reducing the dietary linoleic acid.
Yeah.
Right. Now, go ahead.
I was going to say that I think there's as I've been digging in more around this stuff, there seems to be two different camps of people who demand everything all at once, which is one, give me only outcomes in human data. And then another was prove the mechanism at all cost. And
Right.
everybody wants everything. And I think this is just a way to distract people and to cherry pick the data even further and to argue your position. But thank you for giving us some human outcome information here, because I think it's helpful given how people think about rationalizing the use of these compounds.
Right. Now, my other anecdote, which was how I stopped myself eating linoleic acid and my inflammatory bowel disease resolved in 2 days, is, the epidemiological, there's an EPIC study, I can't remember what that stands for, but it was a big study done in Europe, epidemiology of various different disease states. And they specifically looked at linoleic acid intake and inflammatory bowel disease. And there was a clear, almost 3 odds ratio dose relationship between the highest and the lowest quintiles of omega-6 intake, showing that more omega-6 in the diet is associated with ulcerative colitis, which is one of the most common inflammatory bowel diseases. So
and we see itis there. Colitis just means inflammation of the colon. So
exactly.
We're looking at inflammation. This is a very direct, again, epidemiological, but nonetheless outcome.
Right. In humans. Because if you go to the animal models, the animal models are quite clear. I mean, they've done, I mentioned that the 3 foods that really get me are seed oils, wheat, and hot peppers. And I don't really focus on hot peppers. I read a really funny interview, or I listened to a really funny interview once with the fellow who invented pepper spray. And the interviewer asked him about the safety of it. And he said, well, technically it's a food product. We're just extracting the hot part from the pepper. And he goes, but yes, it will kill you. If you spray it straight in somebody's face, you can cause an inflammatory reaction and it will kill them. Right. So I don't really focus on that because any food that can be made into a bioweapon obviously could potentially be an issue. That's not a huge reach there. And everybody knows that too much spicy food can make you feel uncomfortable. So, but what's really interesting about that is that your body has what's known as the capsaicin receptor. Capsaicin is the chemical that is in pepper spray, right? It's the thing that makes you have this reaction to a hot pepper. Capsaicin is the chemical in a hot pepper, and capsaicin has analogs in your body, which is why you have capsaicin receptors all throughout your body, not just in your mouth and your gut. So what are some of the things that can stimulate the capsaicin receptor in your body? Well, they're oxidized omega-6 fats. So if you take a mouse and you inject HNE, that 4-hydroxy-2-nonanol that we discussed last time, into its limb, it will react as if you were causing pain. And you are causing pain because that chemical binds to the capsaicin receptor and stimulates the neurons to think that you are suffering from a burn. So we have human data, we have, clear mechanistic pathways. And that's a neat one because everybody's experienced eating a pepper that's too hot, or at least I assume everybody's experienced it.
Yeah.
And then,
I think a common one that I would love to get your take on is that this whole increased linoleic acid doesn't lead to increased arachidonic acid from an observation, therefore can't possibly lead to increased inflammation. If you're talking about, like we said earlier, the arachidonic acid leads to these increased cytokines. And cytokines are again a molecule that lead, or carry out the function of inflammation.
Okay, so let's talk.
And before we even dive in there, I just say I did have Dr. Kate Shanahan on a couple months ago, and she talked. She said she went on Bill Maher talking about this, that she would stake her entire reputation on the fact that these omega-6 fatty acids that people are having in seed oils particularly if no one's eaten them in the last 5 years, we would have had 0 people under 50 die of COVID because of a reduced cytokine storm, which is just increased inflammation. So she was going on record saying that she would bet her medical license on that. So she has talked all about that in a previous episode, but again, would love your take on this specific pathway, which seems to get brought up excessively when trying to take this complex thing of inflammation and boiling it down to, oh, see, linoleic acid didn't lead to increased arachidonic acid, therefore.
Okay, so linoleic acid does not lead to increased arachidonic acid. That is correct. Arachidonic acid, like lots of other things in your body, is the levels of it in your blood are tightly regulated, right? And it's important to distinguish that, right? Glucose is also tightly regulated in your blood. Oxygen is your body regulates lots of things very carefully in the blood, right? Because the blood is, it's the supply and disposal pipeline for every tissue in your body. I've never seen an experiment in humans looking at doing this, but actually there was, well, hold that thought, but in animal models, it's quite clear that if you put them on what they call an essential fatty acid deficient diet, which is a low linoleic diet, that you will reduce the level of arachidonic acid in different tissues. Some tissues, like I think it's the heart and brain, conserve arachidonic acid. Other tissues, the level is reduced by a low linoleic acid diet. So nobody is eating a low linoleic acid diet in the industrial world, period, end of story. So we are up at the top level, right? And in fact, one of the indicators that you're on an essential fatty acid deficient diet is your body starts making this fat called meat acid, which is an alternative to omega-6 fats that's made from omega-9 fats. That's the indicator that you're not getting enough omega-6 fats, is that your body starts making this alternative to it. So clearly diet can cause variation in the arachidonic acid level in some tissues. The blood doesn't seem to be one of them. Although there are some studies that do show, like, the Ramsden migraine one I just mentioned, where arachidonic acid level did move around a little bit. So to understand this, though, it's important to understand how your body deals with these fats, right? They're very valuable fats because unlike, say, saturated fat, so if you eat too much carbohydrates, your body turns it into palmitic acid, which is basically an energy storage thing, and it, squirrels it away in your fat tissues. These fats, the polyunsaturated fats, have multiple signaling functions throughout the body. So your body wants to use them for those purposes, right? So if you get an injury, your body takes, let me rephrase that. So when you eat linoleic acid, your body is going to convert a tiny little bit of it into arachidonic acid. It will use that arachidonic acid to make phospholipids. Phospholipids are what makes all of your cell membranes, right? Now, this is not solely a structural thing. When you have an injury, whether it's, an infection or whatever else, the cells that come to deal with the injury take those polyunsaturated fats out of the phospholipids. So it's almost a storage mechanism. And then they can create those inflammatory messengers, or in some cases, they're much more than just inflammatory messengers, from the arachidonic acid or the linoleic acid or the DHA or EPA or whatever else it is that is in those phospholipids. And they can use that to stimulate the inflammatory process and to resolve the inflammatory process, right? So what is interesting is that if you have an excessive linoleic acid content, it stimulates phospholipase to release arachidonic acid, which is used to make those signaling molecules. And then when it's done, that's put back into the phospholipids. So you have a flux, right? outside of what you see in the blood when you take a blood test, in inflammation, you have this flux of arachidonic acid. Now, probably the best example for this are endocannabinoids, which, we're getting, the endocannabinoid system is kind of key in the whole inflammatory pathway. And two of the best studied endocannabinoids are AEA and 2-AG. I can't remember, AEA is known as anandamide. I can't remember what the acronym stands for. 2-AG is 2-arachidonyl glycerol. And from the name, you can guess that it's made from arachidonic acid. So when your body takes arachidonic acid out of the phospholipid, it then makes 2-AG. And when it's finished with 2-AG, it turns it back into arachidonic acid, and it goes back into the phospholipids to be used again, right? So you have this. So now we know from human data, so in animal models, if you feed an animal excess linoleic acid, in its gut, it converts that into arachidonic acid, and it converts that into 2-AG, and that stimulates it to overeat, right? It's how it sends a signal to the brain through the endocannabinoid system, and it makes the animal overeat. It's very well demonstrated. It's so well demonstrated. 2-AG is actually the endogenous homologue of THC, which is in marijuana, as I presume everybody knows. And marijuana is famed for giving you the munchies. It makes you eat, when you eat, when you get the munchies. So I hear, wink, wink, nobody wants to eat a steak. They want to eat junk food. And in animals, when you feed an animal, if you inject THC or 2-AG or AEA into an animal's brain, it makes it eat, right? Even if it's full, but it makes it preferentially eat sugar and carbs, okay? So if you sever the nerve from the gut to the brain, that signal can't get up there, and this effect doesn't happen. Now, what's interesting about that is that in obese humans, you also have elevated levels of these endocannabinoids, and you treat it in humans by blocking that endocannabinoid pathway, right? But again, just to not get too far off the path here, it's taking these rare fats out, using them for signaling purposes, and then putting them back. So yes, simply the fact
measuring the direct levels in the blood, not a good indicator of what's going on from a downstream effect.
You need to be measuring the things that are actually affecting what's going on in the body.
Yeah, and this is what's so tough about creating certain rebuttals, about explaining this stuff to people, is because in order to explain all this stuff, we see how complex it gets and how deep you have to go in to understand what is going on in the biochemistry to be able to have coherent statements about this. And this is the trick where, like, I want to find things that are easy to just communicate to people, but I also don't want to be wrong about what I'm saying. I need to understand, like, okay, how do I know what I know? And it's just tough in this space. Like, I want to give everybody a benefit of the doubt where, if people knew, they would go along with it. I find it to be just, usually they just maybe haven't read a lot of this research, or they don't understand the mechanism, so they don't fully realize that. I think that you had this debate with Alan Flanagan where there's an entire journal dedicated to a certain,
an entire issue of a journal dedicated to omega-6 fats and inflammation and disease.
Yeah. And so, I think he was totally fine about it after you presented it. But this is the thing, that there's so much information, and to not have the full perspective of this stuff, it's easy to get convinced one way or another. Everybody has their biases. I have mine, you have yours, et cetera. And so people have their own biases around this. And I think get pulled into trying to simplify things because it's really hard to take the time to do this.
So, when I was trying to learn about this stuff for a long time, I was looking at the associations between linoleic acid and various different disease states. And there's not a lot out there. And what is out there tends to be kind of vague. And I almost got to the point where I gave up on the topic because I just couldn't find enough evidence for it. And then I realized that that's because I was looking at the wrong things, right? You have to look at the metabolites. And when you start looking at the metabolites, so let's say you're looking at, I don't know, heart disease and linoleic acid, right?
Yeah, let's just use that as a segue, actually, because so I would say I'm pretty confident in wrapping up the inflammation thing. It seems pretty clear due to
Well,
what we're talking about. Okay, so
this is still on that topic, actually,
okay,
but
great.
so let's say you're looking at heart disease and linoleic acid. Now, heart disease is also an inflammatory disease, right?
Hmm.
So yeah, we're not getting off topic, but it's a really good example of how if you see different people who are eating similar amounts of linoleic acid, one may have heart disease and the other one may not have heart disease. Now, we'll observe that people in industrial nations have like a 50% rate of heart disease, and people in non-industrial nations who are not eating linoleic acid having industrial seed oils have a near zero rate of heart disease. So that's kind of interesting. But let's look at the two folks who are, here in the United States eating a lot of seed oils, and one of them has heart disease and one of them doesn't. You may not see any difference in the linoleic acid content in their blood, but what you will see, what does predict heart disease, is oxidized LDL, and specifically LDL that contains Lp(a), right? Both of those, by definition, are oxidized linoleic acid, right? The definition of an oxidized LDL is an LDL particle where the linoleic acid in it has become oxidized. And when it becomes oxidized, it becomes toxic and pro-inflammatory all over the body, right? So that's a marker where if all you ever do is look at linoleic acid, you're completely going to miss the causative pathway. And it's clear in the, it's clear in the cardiology literature that is the causative pathway. There's no other explanation on offer as to why we get heart disease other than oxidized linoleic acid. So if you're a cardiologist and you're publishing research looking only at linoleic acid content, and you're not taking it the next step to what is happening to that linoleic acid content in the body, as you said, the best thing you can say is that you really are not familiar with the mechanisms and actually what's going on. And the fellow who discovered that relationship between dietary linoleic acid and oxidized LDL and heart disease is the fellow who convinced Merck to introduce the first statin, right? So statins are prescribed to block the pathway of linoleic acid in LDL becoming oxidized. And the idea was if you had less LDL and it was taken out of the circulation faster, which is why we've got these PCSK9 inhibitors now, that it wouldn't have the opportunity to get oxidized and become toxic and induce heart disease. So there we have a clear pathway from diet to standard medical practice to disease via an inflammatory pathway.
Seems pretty clear to me. I think that, a tight one here that I'd like to loop in is the claim that, we have these populations where people have higher amounts of N6, linoleic acid, et cetera. Well, they have better, LDL or cholesterol profiles. They have lower LDL. Therefore, it must be good because lower LDL is great, right?
Well, the easiest way to lower your LDL?
What's that?
Have a heart attack.
Right. So this one, I think, becomes a complicated topic because there's so much misinformation about this. All right. I have had Dave Feldman on the podcast, Brett Scher, a couple other people. So dig into that if you guys want to know more about LDL in general. But as it relates to the seed oil promoter saying, well, it's better for your cholesterol.
Right. And we've got a couple of different human RCTs where they demonstrated that increasing intake of seed oils does in fact lower cholesterol and also lower LDL, and also induced worse outcomes from heart disease. LDL is a horrible indicator for heart disease, frankly. It's, So your odds of, if you have quote unquote normal LDL, what you're supposed to have, 75% of the people who have heart attacks have normal LDL, right? It's a lousy risk indicator. Whereas if you have high oxidized LDL and high LDL, you have 16 times higher risk, right? That's a risk indicator.
Just like, I think smoking is one of those things with lung cancer where it's just off the charts. Same thing. And so when we're looking at what actually happens to LDL with high amounts of linoleic acid, I mean, do we have any information about how much of that, like, is the LDL going lower because it's being oxidized from linoleic acid?
Well, okay, so let's talk about, let's talk about and I think it's even on your list here, the Lyon diet heart study.
Let's jump in.
Your list of topics. So the Lyon diet heart study was the most successful, is to this day. It was, I think the first paper was published in 1994. And it is to this day the most successful heart disease prevention study using drugs or anything else. They took a bunch of people who had already had a heart attack, so they had known serious heart disease, and they put them on either, and this is the funny part, the American Heart Association prudent diet under the care of their physicians and their dietitians, or they put them on this Mediterranean diet. Now, one of the specific goals of this dietary intervention was to lower their linoleic acid. And if you go read the paper, they go on at length about why they think this is important. And they lowered the risk versus the control by 70%, right? Statins are, I think, like 20%, right? Now, they did a bunch of other things. So lots of folks say, oh, none of that other, the linoleic acid part didn't matter. What's ironic is it came out only a few years after it was published here in the United States about the connection between linoleic acid and heart disease. So if you're going to read the two papers one after the other, you're going to say, well, gee, if linoleic acid makes LDL, into ox-LDL, which seems to be what causes heart disease, or at least initiates heart disease, which has been shown repeatedly, then obviously lowering linoleic acid would lower heart disease rates, right? It's the cause. So the second paper from that study came out in 1999. The first paper, if I remember correctly, was published in The Lancet, which is a British medical journal. The second paper came out in the AHA's journal Circulation. And there were a number of changes between the first paper and the second paper. First off, the mentions that the control diet was the AHA prudent diet were dropped. The whole linoleic acid section, which had long, since 1961, been a recommendation of the American Heart Association, was really downplayed. And then the following year, the AHA came out with this scientific advisory altering their prudent diet, and they never mentioned the first paper, and they never mentioned anything about, except in passing, in this thing that would never make you think anything of it, about lowering linoleic acid being a possible mechanism for the success of that diet.
We talked earlier about trying to get people the benefit of the doubt that they're doing the right thing. And at times like this, when it's direct organizations not acknowledging obvious information.
Oh, and there's something else I forgot to mention. I always forget to mention this part. So the fellow who convinced the AHA to adopt this high seed oil, low saturated fat diet was, of course, Ansel Keys. In a 1961 paper, that was his idea. We won't get too much off on that tangent. One of the things he came up with was the notion of this PS ratio, polyunsaturated saturated fat ratio. So the other thing that the Lyon diet heart was an exact test of Delorgeril, the principal investigator in that study, didn't think the PS ratio was good. So he designed the diet to go the opposite direction of what Ansel Keys said would be beneficial. And of course, he showed that it was more beneficial. So it was a direct test, and explicitly a direct test of the AHA dietary guideline. What were you saying about hard to figure out these organizations and their...
Yeah, I mean, it's just, it's where I become just sort of defeated in trying to use quote unquote science and trust any sort of institution. If people trust any institutions after the last couple of years, I'd be shocked anyways, but people do. We have things like Tufts recently coming out saying Lucky Charms are better than eggs and meat for nutritional status. Follow the money, obviously. It's tough here, but I think that when you have more of an organizational point of view, it's not ignorance at this point. Like, what do you think?
I mean, I'm not a psychiatrist and I have no desire to be one, right? And I mean, getting into that sort of motivation is a bit of a mystery to me, but when Darius Mozaffarian, who's the dean of the nutrition school at Tufts, he's a cardiologist by training, right? Nothing I'm describing here is anything but the standard cardiology textbook explanation for why we have cardiovascular disease. So why he then simultaneously turns around and on the one hand tells you that you should eat vegetables because they're good for your heart, but you shouldn't eat fried foods because they're bad for your heart. What in blazes does he think foods are fried in nowadays?
Right.
It's not butter. He even wrote in one of his papers, fish is beneficial for the heart, but fried fish appears to not be good for the heart. Well, what do you think it's fried in? It's not fried in fish oil, for heaven's sake.
Maybe it's the breading though, but that would make sense because that's also more healthful than any animal products as well, of course.
Right. Well, it's, maybe we should bread them all in Cheerios. Cheerios get to 95 on his health scale.
Oh my goodness. Okay. So bringing it back to the heart disease thing, talking about the mechanism of heart disease, I think is interesting just to eliminate, and you're talking about, okay, we have this initiation box that has LDL. Do you want to carry it through for someone who's maybe not well-versed in this?
Well, so then that gets us, kind of balancing on the fence between inflammation and heart disease. Let's talk a little bit more about that, right? So what Steinberg, who was the fellow who convinced Merck to introduce the statin, and Whitstone showed back in the 80s was that the first step in atherosclerosis is thought to be the formation of foam cells. And what's a foam cell? A foam cell is a white blood cell that has gone to respond to inflammation. And one of the things that they do, as I mentioned before, is they take up damaged cells to clear out the area, right? And if a white blood cell takes up too many of these damaged cells, and LDL particles, by the way, they become bloated with fat, and if you look at them under a microscope, like these foamy puff balls, right? So that's a foam cell. And if you look at an atherosclerotic lesion, the thing that bursts and gives you a heart attack, they are stuffed full of these foam cells in various states of death and disease. So the first big question is, what causes a white blood cell to turn into a foam cell? And the original idea was that it was LDL. And when Brown and Goldstein who got the Nobel Prize for discovering the LDL receptor, one of their early experiments was taking some white blood cells, macrophages, and incubating them with LDL. And they thought, we're going to show that they turn into foam cells because there's all this LDL there. But it didn't work. It failed. So then they realized that if you modified the LDL, then the white blood cells would hoover it up until they became foam cells. but the mechanism they use to damage the foam cell or damage the LDL isn't something that happens in the body. So they were kind of like, okay, so clearly something bad happens to the LDL, and that's what causes white blood cells to become foam cells. So Steinberg and Whitstone, they figured out what it was that causes this actually in the body. And it's the linoleic acid in the LDL, which gets oxidized. And then when it's oxidized enough, then the foam cells will hoover it up and become, or the white blood cells will hoover it up and become foam cells. And then you're off down the merry pathway to a heart attack.
Is there some cellular marker that sort of puts its flag up and says, hey, white blood cell, come eat me up because I'm too damaged to continue my job? Like what are we like very clear on that?
Well, it's really interesting. There's actually it's the cell itself that does that, but there is a marker that tells the white blood cell, don't bother. We know that this particle is bad and it's flagged for disposal via other ways, right? Because you have a limited number of white blood cells. They're very important cells. It's like, I mean, if you play chess, it's like a rook or you don't use your rook just for anything, right? You reserve it for important moves in chess. So we have a marker that is attached to these oxidized LDLs that tells the white blood cell, we know this is bad. We're going to get rid of it some other way. You go off and find something better to do with your time. And that marker is C-reactive protein, right? So C-reactive protein. So, okay, so now so C-reactive protein responds to pathogens or things that look like pathogens. And oxidized linoleic acid on LDL looks to the body like a pathogen. So the body will either dispose of it via a white blood cell or by one of what they call the scavenger receptors, CD36, which is what white blood cells also use, but it's almost every cell in the body has these, right? So the entire body wants to dispose of these things. And one of the ways that it does it is by flagging it or a pathogen with a CRP, which is this basically tag, it's like, I don't know, putting a tag on your garbage, telling a garbage man to take it away, right? So CRP is a marker for what we call sterile inflammation, right? It's a marker also for inflammation, because it does react to injury. I mean, you mentioned you talked to Dave Feldman. He and I have gone back and forth on Twitter over our experiences with CRP numbers and scaring the daylights out of our physicians. The easiest way to raise your CRP is to go run a marathon because you create systemic damage from overdoing it. And if you're well enough trained, that doesn't happen, by the way. But unfortunately, Dave and I aren't well enough trained as runners to not experience this. And the first time I'd read about this and then I forgot all about it. And then I ran a half marathon that I wasn't well trained for. And I had a regularly scheduled physical with my doctor the Monday after the race. And I went in and my CRP level was sky high. He was so freaked out. And I was like, oh, you don't have to worry about it. Here are 2 papers that explain that this is typical for people who go run a race, So this is, again, it's a normal response to inflammation. It's part of your healing process. If you have damaged tissues that are damaged in the race, your body flags them and says, okay, get rid of them. They're not non-functional. And then you have the opportunity to replace those cells. So that's a perfectly normal part of the pathway. But if you look at what they're actually doing as regards to LDL, they are attaching to the oxidized omega-6 fats in the LDL particle. They're the marker for it. So when you see people say, oh, elevated, and you sort of have to go through and translate lots of things. Once you start really understanding the mechanisms, sort of like in the Matrix, where guy saw those codes going down and he was like, oh, that's a redhead. So when you hear somebody say, oh, high CRP, you have to think, oh, high oxidized omega-6 fats. Or when you hear somebody say oxidative stress, which is, another thing that leads to heart disease and all these other chronic diseases, you have to say to yourself, oh, oxidized omega-6 fats, because that's the mechanism. We have these things called DAMPs or PAMPs, DAMP or PAMP. And what that stands for is damage-associated molecular pattern or pathogen-associated molecular pattern, which is a pattern on a cell that looks like a pathogen or looks like damage. And that's part of what your body is reacting to in this inflammatory pathway. Now, again, why and how this progresses from, just having some seed oils to getting a heart attack 20 or 40 years later, this is not an acute process, right? I mean, seed oils do have acute toxicity, but it's very minor. It's just basically you get nauseous from eating them. It doesn't give you a heart attack the next day, just like smoking a cigarette doesn't give you lung cancer the next day. This is a process that occurs over years where damage ramps up to the point where your body can't handle it anymore, based on the data that we have at any rate.
So this is more of a history question. You said you're a history buff, but what were the things that forced the US to ban trans fats? And do we have any hope of doing that with linoleic acid seed oils, given the time?
I think we do, actually. So there's a fellow named Fred Kummerow. I may not be pronouncing his name correctly. And he was a lipid scientist who wrote a lot of fundamental papers on linoleic acid metabolism and trans fats. And, the fact that trans fats are created from seed oils, right? That's where they come from. They're either a product of cooking with seed oils, and let's remember, seed oils are cooking oils, or it's a product of what we call partial hydrogenation. So now, hydrogenation is the process of adding hydrogen to a linoleic acid molecule to make it a stearic acid molecule, right? Stearic acid is one of the main fats in the fat in a cow, stearic from steer. A partially hydrogenated fat is a linoleic acid that didn't get the full complement of hydrogen atoms to turn it into stearic acid. And that's beneficial from the point of somebody trying to make margarine, because stearic acid has the composition of a bar of soap or a candle. It's not spreadable, right? Whereas a partially hydrogenated linoleic acid molecule is softer, right? It's spreadable. So it makes for a nice margarine. Or, if you want to use a fat for baking, you don't want something that's the composition of a bar of soap. Can't mix a bar of soap with the flour very easily to make a cake. So Kummerow was the guy who kept pounding on the fact that these trans fats were bad. And he finally wrote a citizen's petition to the FDA, which is still available on the FDA's website. In fact, I have a copy of it. It's quite entertaining because it's not all that long or complicated. And he called on them to ban it, and he went through the evidence that it's harmful, a lot of which was, lab research that he'd done himself. And then when the FDA ignored it, he sued them. And I think he was 96 years old when he sued them. God bless this guy. And then they had to respond, and they responded by banning them, right? So Kummerow...
I've never heard this story before.
Really?
Yeah, it's fascinating. Continue on. This is great.
So Kummerow, I forget what the... so now what's really interesting is that the fellows who did a lot of the research, the epidemiology that backed up Kummerow, were the fellows at the Harvard School of Public Health, specifically Walter Willett. So there's I can't remember the journal right now, but they solicited a article from Fred Kummerow, and the article is titled "My Diet at 100." And this is a worldwide nutritional journal. And they said, we have never published any dietary recommendations before in the history of this journal, we are making an exception for Fred Kummerow, who has clearly reached, he was working in his lab until his late 90s. So he was clearly in excellent health. And the introduction for this article was written by Walter Willett, talking about the impact Fred Kummerow had and how he led to Willett realizing the dangers of trans fats and doing all the epidemiology. So one of the recommendations in Kummerow's article was to avoid vegetable oils. So theoretically, somebody could write another petition a la Fred Kummerow. And we got a ton of evidence now. We've got probably far more evidence for the dangers of seed oils than trans fats.
Yeah, I think the thing that's challenging, and which I want you to address another question here, which I find interesting, is linoleic acid an essential fatty acid? And we'll get into that in a second, but trans fats, there's no argument for that. They were from the food process.
Well, just remember, Kummerow was very specific. It's synthetic trans fats that are made from the hydrogenation process. There are another interesting twist in this little story. Dariush Mozaffarian in Harvard University actually patented a trans fat that is found in dairy because of the health benefits.
Perfect. Okay, so you see, let's just say linoleic acid's a bad guy here from this production, but it's also naturally occurring in these seeds or legumes or whatever. So how would this make sense? Is it over 1%, 2%, 5%? I mean, this is where it just, even a recommendation on a ban or a limiting seems really confusing to me. So I guess first question would be, are they essential? Is it essential fatty acid? And then the second one would be, how do we even institute a guideline or a ban or a proposition on this, being as they're naturally occurring in all of these foods?
That's a really great point, Anthony. Is it essential? So the evidence for it being essential was based on work that was done in the 1930s, showing that if you put rodents on a fat-free diet, they got what's now known as essential fatty acid deficiency, which is basically a dermal problem. They had flaky skin, their hair fell out, and they got flaky tails. And in a human who was on an essential fatty acid deficient diet, she got scaling on the palms of her hands, right? So that was the 1930s.
Is that just because there's not certain phospholipids in the dermis, and that turns over so quickly that you can notice it there first?
Well, the point is that was a fat-free diet, right? Nobody eats a fat-free diet, right? People may eat tiny amounts of fat, but nobody eats a fat-free diet. So at any rate, fast forward 100 odd years, and we're in this situation where children who are born unable to digest food through their intestine are put on a diet, are put on an intravenous soybean oil infusion.
Hold on a second. We seriously went from the 1930s thing where we said, okay, we're seeing that a zero fat diet leads to this, therefore linoleic acid is an essential fatty acid.
Yeah, well, if you give the rodents linoleic acid, it resolved the signs of the deficiency.
But what about if you give them any other fatty acids?
Anthony, you're asking too many good questions here. So there was a fellow Holman in the 60s and 70s who did a bunch of those studies, but he never actually got around to looking. He just assumed that linoleic acid was essential, so he never bothered to actually do the test that would show whether or not it was. He just forgot. And I've heard that firsthand from a scientist who did a lot of research in this and actually spoke to Holman. So fast forward to 10 or so years ago, and we've got these children who are being given this soybean oil infusion directly into their veins, and they often die of liver failure, requiring liver transplants. These are typically prenatal cases, right? And they're trying to figure out what they can do to treat these kids because the quote unquote treatment is killing them. And they decide they get a kid who's got a soybean allergy, so they can't give him, the soybean infusion, and they don't want him to get essential fatty acid deficiency. So they try this fish oil infusion, and it works just great. And the fish oil has about a 0.5% of linoleic acid, so a tiny little amount. So then they got another kid who was a teenager who, for some reason, couldn't eat and also was soybean allergic. So he wound up being on a fat-free diet for a while, and he got this essential fatty acid deficiency, and they gave him fish oil, and it cured it, the essential fatty acid deficiency. Now, what's interesting is if you get liver failure from being on this soybean oil infusion and they switch you over to the fish oil infusion, it cures that too. And apparently nobody who's ever been on the fish oil infusion has ever gotten liver failure. So lots of these doctors, though, they learned in medical school that linoleic acid is essential because of this test back in the 30s, and they wouldn't try the fish oil infusion. So Boston Children's Hospital, which is the folks who did all this work, they finally decided to do the test. And they put these mice on a diet where the only two sources of fat were DHA and arachidonic acid. DHA, the omega-3 fat, and fish oil, arachidonic, is, an omega-6 fat that you can get typically from meat or is made from linoleic acid in your body. And they gave them no linoleic acid at all. And then they maintained them for 10 generations of mice, and they didn't get an essential fatty acid deficiency. So after 100-ish years, they may have been 90 years actually, but whatever, they were actually able to show that linoleic acid is not essential. Now, I will point out that this is kind of a moot point because even fish oil has 0.5% of linoleic acid. And every food that you eat that has some fats in it is probably going to have some linoleic acid. I mean, even coconut oil, which has almost none, has like 0.5%. So practically speaking, it's either not essential or there's no need to take anything more than 0.5%, which is what you can get by eating a whole food diet. So there is no, despite what the dietary guidelines will tell you, there is no need for any sort of supplementary omega-6 fats in the human diet, unless you're under the care of a doctor or you're in a lab.
So we continue to still give people this intralipid though. And it was a big focus during COVID as well, when people went under respirators, right? Hooking them up to the main line of soybean oil.
Well, they generally, when they put somebody on a respirator, unless they have to be under a respirator for a long period of time, any doctor who knows what he's doing is going to desperately avoid also giving them intralipid, because if you put somebody on a respirator and you give them intralipid, you increase their chances of dying 7 times.
Wow.
Because you induce oxidative stress, and the excess linoleic acid causes what's known as ARDS, which is acute respiratory distress syndrome, right? SARS kills you by inducing ARDS, right? And putting somebody on a respirator and giving them intralipid intravenously will also induce ARDS. Not all the time, but 7 times greater rates of death. And that is from a 6-year-long study that was done in an ICU, where they were like, why are all these patients we put on respirators and giving intralipid dying? And it's quite amusing because, it wasn't good science, but it was excellent medicine, because as the study progressed, they started not giving people intralipid, and their mortality rate went from 24% down to 3 or 4% or something like that.
Well, now that we have this information and the omega-3 rich fish oil infusion is available, talking about banning certain things, how is intralipid not banned by this point?
Well, intralipid actually gets a black box label from the FDA, which is their highest warning, which is basically says this product can kill you. So Omegaven, the folks up at Boston Children's were able to convince the FDA that Omegaven was so safe that it didn't, as opposed to every other lipid infusion, all of which contain high levels of omega-6 fats of varying degrees, but higher than Omegaven. So the only lipid infusion that doesn't have a black box warning is the one with the absolute lowest level of omega-6 fats.
Do you have any idea about the usage rates between intralipid or any other high omega-6 oil?
I think intralipid is still, there are a couple of others. There's something called SMOF lipid, which is like a blend of different types of lipids. I mean, from what Boston Children's looked at, all of the other ones other than Omegaven cause liver damage. And yeah, mostly they're not using Omegaven. I don't even know if Omegaven's approved for adults yet. The FDA, last I looked into it was a few years ago, and the FDA has a, what they call, I can't remember the term they use, but basically, if you get intralipid and you start getting liver failure, then they'll give you Omegaven.
Oh my God. Okay. A little disappointed with humanity on that one.
Well, it's even better. You know, I have a long post on all of this, ARDS and or COVID-19 ARDS and seed oils, and you know, I went through the guidelines for TPN, and even the guidelines say that, you know, we have to give people intralipid even though it looks like it's harmful because there's nothing else.
Yeah, well, this seems like an important thing to write a letter to FDA on. Regarding the second part of the question, which was this stuff, like you said, fish oil, okay, we even have 0.5%, coconut oil, animal products, pretty much anything with a fatty acid profile, we have some amount of linoleic acid. So how, if we were, I mean, even if we were recommending to somebody, or let's say the next step was having a certifying body, like there's just different nutrition certifications right now. We could maybe do a low linoleic acid certification, one where we test the fatty acids, or a ban via a letter through the FDA. Is it like, this seems pretty relative to the rest of someone else's nutrition, their diet and everything else. And so is there a cutoff point of 2%, 3%? Is it from more industrial processed food? Do we have any mechanism that shows that that's worse because it's more oxidized already? Or how would you think about the recommendations when it comes to absolutes here?
I mean, I would look at what we've done with sugar, right? So fruits appear to be perfectly healthy, even when they contain a fair bit of sugar. And if you look at what the dietary guidelines say, we don't ban sugar, even though pretty much everybody agrees that excess sugar is not good for you. What they do is flag products that have added sugar. And I would think that as a first step, we could certainly flag products that have added omega-6 fats and say, you know, this is thought due to animal models and human data to be harmful in excess, which is, you know, copy the language that we're using for sugar currently.
Yeah, it's interesting.
That's certainly a start. And I mean, Mazafarian's new food thing, whatever it's called, from Tufts.
Food Compass, TM.
Food Compass, thank you. What they seem to be doing is just looking at basically three components of a food. They're looking at the added sugar, the saturated fat content, and the salt content, right? So they could just add a, you know, added omega-6 fat content, right? I mean, we label foods based on their trans fat content, even though it's now banned, the label's still there. And
because you can play these games where you actually have
you can have 0.5% of trans fat and label it as 0, right? But let's, you know, honestly, if you did that exact same thing with linoleic acid, you know, 0.5% of added linoleic acid isn't really, I think, going to be a problem.
Interesting. Yeah, maybe I'll start thinking about my policy career and lobbying and figuring out how we can get this done. Another sort of related thing that I haven't looked into much, but I have the suspicion that there's a lot of people, especially in like the paleo-ish community, that have talked a long time about relative amounts of omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, and you want, it to be 2-to-1, et cetera. And so I see a lot of instances where, I'm interested in the agriculture area and how all this stuff has been shuttled into our pork and chicken via feed. These monogastric animals incorporate these fatty acids to their tissues. And some savvy farmers have said, oh, okay, great. People care about that. Let me give you a high omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. So they'll feed animals and they'll add in a bunch of things like fish byproducts, whatever.
They use flax for those omega-3 eggs.
And I've asked for some of these farmers to send over their fatty acid profiles, and the absolute amount per 100 grams of linoleic acid in these is actually more. It's more. And so I have an example. I can maybe redact the information or share it openly. I guess it doesn't really matter, but it goes from, I think it was something like 17 grams per 100 gram with the high omega-6 before they added.
And that was in an animal?
That was in chicken, and adding in and improving their ratio. Yes, it took the ratio from like 20-to-1, almost no omega-3 before, to, I can't remember which omega-3s they were looking at, but it improved the ratio to about 2-to-1, but the linoleic acid went from, I think, 17 grams to 22 grams per 100 grams of fat. So basically 17% to 22%. So it actually increased it overall. And so my question is,
how on earth did they manage that?
I have no idea. But the ratio is better. And so people go, oh, there's omega-3 and omega-6 ratio. Should be 2-to-1. Great. My thinking is that this makes sense contextually and evolutionary perspective of the ratio makes sense when you're getting real foods that are low in absolute amounts of omega-6. And so the ratio is what it is. But when you raise that bar up of both 3 and 6, and now you're getting still 20+% of the animal and omega-6, is this just as bad?
Yes. And you may, so I have a post on my blog. It's subtitled, "We've Come for Your Liver," from that old Monty Python sketch, which is quite twisted. But so what they do is they feed these two mice these insanely high PUFA diets. And I think I mentioned this before, the mice on the insanely high omega-6 diet stayed lean. They didn't get obese, but they got liver failure, right? And what was interesting about those two diets is that those mice had the better omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, and they still got liver failure. So yes, like, the Japanese and the Chinese, genetically very similar. One of them has a raging obesity problem and one of them doesn't. The Japanese don't, I think, because they eat so much DHA, but they still have pretty high rates of heart disease, historically speaking, and what they call the Western cancers. And
their diabetes is going through the roof. I think it's actually getting to the point of being close to Americans.
Yes. And the biggest change, well, there've been a number of changes in the Japanese diet since the end of World War II, but one of the biggest changes was their increased seed oil consumption. And so they blame it for their health problems. So
maybe increased omega-3 might skew the downstream effects a little bit, but
overall, so maybe you won't get fat, but you'll still get diabetic and cancer and heart disease, just maybe at lower rates than otherwise.
There's the one paper, I forget the name of it or the authors, but it was the mouse one where it was the 8% linoleic acid, 1%. And then they had, I think, one that was 8% with 1%.
Alfheim, 2012. Yeah.
And that showed as well that basically having omega-3 in there was protective against some rates of the increase in obesity.
Right.
But it seems like liver failure, some of these other things, doesn't matter. Absolute amount is still like you can't counteract, like we were talking about earlier to even kick this thing off. You have some things that are pro-inflammatory, some that are anti-inflammatory. When you get over a certain threshold, it probably just doesn't matter. There's no amount of anti-inflammatory sort of action you can have on omega-3 or even anything else that you're taking.
Right. That's right. You've only got so much antioxidant capacity in your body, and you can overwhelm it. And that gets us back to Dr. Cate's comments about omega-6 and COVID. I mean, ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome, is what kills you in COVID-19. And what causes ARDS is well demonstrated in the literature. It's the conversion of linoleic acid into something called leukotoxin, diol, in your blood by your white blood cells. And that causes ARDS, right? I mean, if you take an animal and you inject leukotoxin diol into it, they will die like that from ARDS. And similarly, there was another paper that just came out that looked at 4-hydroxy-2-nonanol, HNE, and ARDS, and the people who were dead had sky-high rates of HNE and no antioxidants left. So they're getting a double whammy. They're getting leukotoxin delivered via their white blood cells in an attempt to kill the pathogen. And, you get back to this, when your body goes to start, so if you put white blood cells in a vial full of linoleic acid, they will convert all of it to leukotoxin diol, right? All of it until they run out. So if you put them into a situation where you flicked the switch where they're like, okay, we need to make this stuff, and you have this vast excess of what you're supposed to have, they're just going to keep chugging through it, right? They don't have an off switch. They don't have a rate limiter, apparently.
Oh boy. Okay. I think more of the story is no added omega-6 fats, kids.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
And
think
that's got to include your, the animals that you eat as well as yourself.
right. Yeah. I mean, I think that the, farm salmon, any amount, I think I still haven't found anything other than what Brad's doing at Firebrand Meats that is lower PUFA, pork or chicken. Even the fanciest pasture raised stuff is still getting corn and soy feed, typically GMO as well, if you care about that kind of thing. So it's tricky. Yeah. So we will continue to dig into this stuff. I would love to get people's feedback on this episode, and potentially we do a quick fire Q&A. I don't know if there's such a thing as quick fire, but that would be fun to potentially do another wrap up one here. I know we sort of went into the weeds a bunch of different areas in this episode. So if you have questions,
but I think, unfortunately, I seem to do, my minimum soundbite length seems to be 2 hours.
Good.
I think we covered a lot of good stuff.
So again, last episode, we gave a shout out to where people can find you. If again, you want to touch on that, Twitter, website.
I'm at Tucker Goodrich on Twitter, and my website, which is going to be fixed soon, hopefully with a shorter URL, is currently it's yelling-stop.blogspot.com.
Well, as always, Tucker, thanks again for the time and your work in the space.
It's been great, Anthony. Thank you so much for having me on the show.